Bienvenue à toutes et tous à la podcast de Conceptualisme ineffable. Je suis content d'accueillir Amir Alibhai, qui est le curator et performing arts expert, head of performing arts à la Musée Aga Khan. Thank you very much for being here with us, Amir Ali. And this podcast conversation has been a long time in the making, and I'm very glad to have you with us here today.
It's my pleasure.
So to set the scene for people, we got acquainted through the Jubilee Arts Festival in 2019, I think, and that was how we came to know of each other, and from there a beautiful relationship has flourished, and it's interesting to meet another Ismaili who is one immersed in critical participation and also artistic and curatorial discourse at this kind of level. I didn't know that we had Ismailis that did this. So I think you're maybe one of three Ismailis that I know who are doing this at this kind of level. So it gives us Ismailis a little bit of hope, you know. It's like, oh, I know an Ismaili who does this.
Yeah, it's great, and those. I think it's always these opportunities where we have the chance to meet one another are important, precisely because of what you've just pointed out, that that once we discover one another, I think it elevates the entire conversation and the work that we're each trying to do, because there's a sense of community, first of all. But there's also a sense of being able to not feel, oh, am I thinking something that's just way out there? Sometimes you need people who you can bounce thoughts and ideas off of before you present them to a wider audience, because creative people tend to sometimes get very focused.
We need a milieu.
Exactly. And that milieu, there needs to be a part of it that is safe. This is old language, safe space, which is what I was alluding to earlier, where there's the opportunity to sort of say the crazy thing, that the audacious thing that might be creeping up, and say it in safety, where it's not going to be misinterpreted, or if it is, that there's an opportunity to, dispel that misunderstanding. And I think that, safety is about forgiveness. It's about acceptance. And it's about disagreement as much as it is about agreement.
Yes.
As long as that, that disagreement is in the spirit. I've been in the milieu, as you've mentioned, for a while. It's more than 30 years now that I've been working in the professional arts in Canada. As an artist, as a curator, as an educator.
I mean, you pioneered the idea of community arts, which I think many people don't necessarily know about you. You pioneered that idea in Canada.
Well, I think that, there was an entire community across the country that was very interested in this emerging
discipline
practice at the time. And I'm talking about the early 90s, early to mid 90s, and then into the 2000s. And I was based on the West Coast. And we had, inspiring artists and speakers brought by the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation of all organizations, one wouldn't think. But they had brought speakers from Australia, Marla Gup Guppy, who was an artist who was a pioneer globally in this field of
mm.
bringing, and then of course there were antecedents in theater, people and scholars like Paulo Freire, Augusto Boal,
Yes,
really important artists and artists who worked in community, but they were philosophers and
exactly.
educators.
They were thinkers.
Much,
They were thinkers. So
exactly.
they were public intellectuals just as much as they were practicing artists. So
Yeah, and
they were interlocutors. They were able to articulate their practice so that the public and the layperson would understand what was going on. It wasn't the academia of the ivory tower. It was like, here we are, come join us. So that's what I mean by you were on the vanguard of that, because I think you took that approach of, let's be inclusive in our practice. Let's be meaningfully and with intention inclusive in our practice.
Yeah. And then, working at the museum for the last 10 years and moving into a world which was much more about, the professional arts, the fine arts, the
high
that
art,
whole aesthetic. Well, yes, but also, an opportunity to include as high art that was being made in other parts of the world, in other cultural contexts. Contemporary artists from, South Asia, from the Middle East, from Iran, from Iraq, from North Africa, from all over the world, actually. And with this broader mandate, which resonates with
new genres that perhaps weren't even on the mainstream, like Afrofuturism, for example. I remember that massive Lego installation. I mean, that was very interesting because that was out of left field. I didn't expect the Aga Khan Museum to include something like that in their collection. I mean, that was forward thinking of whoever proposed that and got that done.
Well, I think the vision for the museum, and in particular, and its collection, which is, the collection of His Highness the Aga Khan, it is also a collection that has its own. It's a private collection, yes. So private collections tend to be a little bit eccentric, very interesting for that reason. But they also tend to have, so there's a lot of manuscripts, for example. So clearly the collectors in the family were interested in manuscripts and paintings, many miniature paintings.
Some of the most beautiful miniatures I've ever seen. I mean, it's I remember your former museum director saying this is the equivalent of the Mona Lisa, but in Muslim art.
The Shah,
the Shahnameh, or the Shah.
Exactly, the Shah Tamas Shahnameh. Yeah. It's a very well-known manuscript that was broken up into many pieces and sold to various places. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has a significant number of the folios. There are many, of course, in Iran, in Tehran. And there are also Lakma on the West Coast has a few. And we have, and I think we have one of the, if you want to call it, I don't like the word, masterpieces from that folio, and that is the Court of the Gayumars, and that is incredible work. But again, this idea of, okay, why is that important? This is something that is centuries old, and what's its relevance to us today? Other than its obvious, its aesthetic value, it's beauty, it's the virtuosity.
So then let's paint a context. For example, if you look at the tokenization of value in today's society, especially with NFTs and other forms of tokenization, why is something valuable? I recently examined with someone I really respect the idea of value, and I realized that just like anything else, value is a concept. It's something that we've made up to say this is valuable, and so in examining why it's relevant, we're we're also making a value judgment, if you see what I'm trying to say here, about why something matters.
True. True.
And
I think that,
it might mean different things to different people. The collectors might have a very different idea of why they value that, as opposed to, for example, a 5-year-old who walks past it in the museum.
You're absolutely right. And I think that there are as many, interpretations and probably values for any given object in the world, including art, as there are people perceiving that object. So, I do think that values, as you say, are, constructed through narratives that we create as societies, as people, as individuals, about the world, and
Yes.
our priorities around that. But we have to sort of be in the world and look at what are the values of the society that we live in, what are the interests, what are the issues, and is there anything, not just, why is this object made hundreds of years ago still important, still valued today?
And not just its historical value.
Well, it's rare, it's a unique object. It's certainly stunningly beautiful.
And as you described, a virtuoso, I mean, it's the equivalent of a virtuoso piece of music, for example.
Exactly. And it changes the way one sees the world.
Yeah. It's performative.
Absolutely, in that sense. Like, for example, in that painting, not only are there representations of characters from the Shahnameh, the court of Kayumars, the first king, the just king, the king who understood the animals, who understood nature. It was a utopian kind of time.
Well, he was the king of kings, right? He's the exemplar of the kings.
Well, yes, and yet we sustain this, can we carry this out? He sees the demise. But even the rocks in this painting have faces and spirits. So this idea, say, in today's world, where we're facing, this crisis with our climate, with global warming, with the environment being degraded to a place because we've lost that respect, that idea of imbuing nature with the same intelligence and rights, and
which it has, and the first peoples have always respected the land as the most ancient ancestor.
Absolutely. So, this is the value of hearing one another's stories, which we tell through these objects, of hearing stories from the past, from the present. And, to your earlier point about, the foresight and including a piece of Afrofuturism in the collection of the museum. It's because that the collection in the museum is objective and aim is to be relevant. And we need to engage with conversations that are happening today and connect them to objects and ideas that were happening in the past, because humanity is not that inventive.
It's not static. And it's not invented. The funny thing, that's why history keeps repeating itself, because that lesson needs to keep being learned. So ironically, by including that work of Afrofuturism, for example, you're commenting on the reign of Mansa Musa. But someone has to look at that and be like, okay, well, that's the connection. There's a connection there. It's not obvious in the sense that, maybe the curators didn't include that, but I think that's the whole point of having a collection or a museum. Every single person that goes into that museum is a curator if they're doing it right, because they're telling the story, they're finding the connection, they're finding the narrative. So it is for, like, in the Muslim community, you have the ulama, you have the learned scholars, but as His Highness has said on many occasions, the Quran is open to any interpretation as long as you're trying to be faithful to what the message is. So I think the same thing of a museum goer that comes to the Aga Khan Museum. If they're really trying to understand what it's about, then whatever connection they wish to draw is relevant and should be celebrated. And I think you guys have done that. You had the public curates, for example, within your recent programming, and your Museum Without Walls has been incredible because you're involving people from disparate places in the narrative that may otherwise never have been part of a museological, linguistic and ontological perspective. That is brilliant.
Well, Alhamdulillah, right? Because that,
because as the artistic director, I know that many of these choices, were made by you and your team. And so, I'm in awe really of what you guys are doing and how it's been done as well, because there's a certain faithfulness and unadulteredness to the programming, to the quality of the programming. You're retaining the fidelity of it. And that's really hard to do in a digital space, but you guys have somehow done it, which is an accomplishment.
And again, I think it's because we understand as a team, right? And it definitely, like, our curators who develop all the exhibitions, and our education people that develop all the interpretation, our marketing people who actually who also contribute to how
it's framed, like
how it's framed, and what are we doing. So the Museum Without Walls is really like the it's all the content makers at the museum. And I, as an artistic director at the museum, I'm focused on performing arts and music mostly, but during this shutdown, at least initially, I was tasked with bringing together everyone's content. And as a team, we were always seeking this interactive and interesting. First of all, there's so much out there to choose from. And how do we remain true to our mandate and what we're about, what we're trying to do, which is about cross-cultural and building bridges between communities without it's about some of the myths that might be out there in popular culture about Islam and Muslims, through the arts, through showing objects and ideas, presenting ideas that continue to be talked about and continue to be relevant in Muslim societies. And we're not that different. There has been, Islamophobia or xenophobia or discrimination of all sorts raises constantly. We've just been through, or we're coming through, we're still in this pandemic, and the world has been altered. The space between us has changed forever. So, again, I think a bit of a reset, like these values. I think the meanings we find in our collection, in our objects, or in the themes.
And that's the interesting thing. The interesting thing. I think the museum also poses the fundamental question of what is Islamic art? Is there such a thing as Islamic art? And I think that's just as relevant a question as exploring, how an object from, China is a relevant piece in the collection. Because to ask that question of what is Muslim art and what is Islamic art, or what is Islamic architecture, that's a very good question, because that'll point out that, in fact, by trying to define it in some ways, and the way it's been defined by Western culture and Western museological practice, is actually limiting. There are many things that are Muslim or that are Islamic that are very subtle. I mean, for example, Al-Khwarazmi, the Muslim polymath, who's the founder of algebra and whose name basically was Latinized into algorithm, he took Indian numbers, the numeral system from 0 to 9, and codified it into Persian, Arabic, and other relevant languages, and made sure that knowledge was disseminated from the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Now, to me, that's part of the legacy of Islam. It's not just that we came with our own ideas, preconceived ideas of what should be, what culture is. We came with an eclectic, let's say, respect for knowledge, no matter where it came from. We came with this respect for excellence, for divine inspiration. So whoever was at the forefront, at the vanguard of whatever it is they were doing, they were incorporated into this idea of what Islamic or Muslim art is. And therefore, to me, the museum is actually continuing that narrative. It's continuing that legacy that we have, whether it's the golden age of Islam, whether it's the libraries of Alamut, or the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. To me, the Aga Khan Museum is a contemporary symbol of that legacy. That's what it is. That's what it represents to me.
I like that. I think that's a really beautiful metaphor and a valid one for sure.
As a seat of knowledge, as a font of knowledge.
It's certainly what we humbly aspire to, because we have we're given tools. We've got an amazing building. We've got an auditorium. We've got
with magnificent acoustics.
Great, exactly. And we have this this incredible park, formal garden out front. We have our permanent collection, that we have access to, with these over 1,000 objects spanning over 1,000 years. It's quite a small but kind of a jewel, and we need to be able to share not only those objects and their experience, but what they're about, the thinkers you've just alluded to, this idea of being a house of wisdom. I think is beautiful, because education is at our core, and the education,
that's the central mandate. That's
exactly.
That's the reason the museum was founded in the first place. It wasn't meant to be there as a set of crown jewels. It was meant to be in flux. It was meant to be a constant questioning, a constant search. And that to me is what exemplifies a living, breathing institution, not just an ossified, dead set of bones that people come to look at.
You're absolutely correct. I think that that's something we've always wanted to avoid, was that very colonial idea of museums.
Yes.
Yes. How do we reposition ourselves? I mean, I think that maybe museum is not the right name for who we are. This is a very personal idea. I'm not representing any
official narrative
to change that. It's a personal narrative, but I've always kind of thought about that, because museum, just because the word conjures up certain notions in the minds of people.
Yes.
And not only the public at large, but very specific groups of people that we seek to work with, who
well, exactly, like the Benin bronzes and the Elgin marbles and God knows how many other things in the British Museum, which are unrightfully, unjustly held in that collection. It's a trauma. It's absolutely a trauma. So I would like to, and this is just, again, my personal opinion, is instead of calling it the Aga Khan Museum, we could call it, in reference to that historic time, the Beit al-Hikmah founded by the Aga Khan. In fact, I would advocate that they change it to the House of Wisdom, because that to me encompasses what that building is trying to be and what it is. Frankly, it's not a museum. And I know
as the word art,
yes.
Yeah. This is me, right? As long as the word art is there somewhere, because so maybe the House of Art and Wisdom,
right? Because that's the point, right? You're right, because the Beit al-Hikmah didn't have really necessarily an artistic component. So the House of Art and Wisdom, I mean, that would be amazing.
Or maybe it did, because Hikmah. I'm not an Arabic speaker, but for me it sounds a bit like haq,
which is true.
So I'm wondering if there's a connection there, because I mean, it would be ostentatious, right? And I think that that's probably why it's not called something like that.
We're still trying to retain our, the low key. We want to
Well,
be radical. We want to be
it's not
radical,
about
but
low
in a way that
key.
fits in.
It's not about low key. It's about actually being able to live up to, our words, our aspirations, So I think that
well then maybe, and this is just my idea, I remember that originally the museum was supposed to have a library where the Salon de Bellerive is, and now the library is kind of in the back, tucked away. Maybe that space could specifically be called the Beit al-Hikmah. That would be cool.
Oh, I think that I think that's a lovely idea. I think being able to reclaim, to be able to reclaim in the Western world those things that are valuable, those things that are beautiful, those things that contribute to societies and communities where we live.
Without which the European Renaissance wouldn't have happened. Let's remember always that actually it's the Muslim scholars that translated the ancient Greek and Sanskrit texts, and that's why the European Revolution even happened. Let's always, with humility, reference and respect that. That is the contribution of Islam. We wouldn't be speaking on the internet on our computers here if it wasn't for Al-Khwarizmi. Let's always remember that.
You're absolutely right, and I think that again, that
in fact, the West couldn't have happened without Islam and without the golden age of Islam. The whole idea of Western civilization is rooted, ironically, in that golden age of Islam. The idea of empiricism, which the West has claimed many times before, wrongfully, I might add, is a Muslim idea that came from the golden age of Islam. That is well proven. It's and then nobody in their right mind would argue that. And so when I speak to Western scholars, I always point this out, and I point it out with the due humility and respect, but also to say credit is due where credit is due. And you cannot claim ideas that are not yours. You did not invent empiricism. It came from the golden age of Islam. And in fact, the way we see the natural sciences, through mathematics, through empiricism, even the scientific method was invented in that golden age of Islam.
And, and I think that it's really important to, as you say, own that, to reclaim that, to know that. And it's really about dispelling, in many ways, ignorance, right? And ignorance not as a fault in anyone, but ignorance as actually the human condition.
Yes.
It
exactly
really,
right.
We all around, no matter where we're from. And again, for me,
and the idea of knowledge as a fallacy, right? Because, the thing is, a lot of people will say, oh, you're striving towards enlightenment. You think you know. Well, actually, the greatest scholars always bowed their head to the ineffable, knowing that actually what they know is a tiny fragment of what there is to know. So in that sense, when you say Beit al-Hikmah, you're not saying we are the house of wisdom. You're saying let's build it. It's an invitation. It's not a statement. It's an invitation.
Absolutely, and it's an action rather than a place, as you say, and not an ossified place, but it's energy needs to move. It needs to transform. It needs to change. Right. And we need to be maybe a conduit, like a dervish is, for this energy that we can, and again, I'm being metaphorical, but I think you know what I mean. One thing I wanted to sort of say, though, however, is that I would wish for a world where we can transcend these notions of East and West and the Islamic world and the European world. And, it's really, because I really start to see everything, like all art, because I've worked as a contemporary artist. I know I know my Western art history. Actually, I'm continuing to learn about what they call Islamic art.
It's you know what it is? It's the confluence of everything and nothing.
Well, it's humanity's legacy.
Yes.
The work we have in our museum collection is for humanity. It's not for Muslims, and it's not for Ismailis, and it's not for...
En fait, c'est exactement ça. Et je crois que si tout le monde regardait cette perspective, il y a moins de conflits, moins de divisions dans le monde, parce qu'on respectait tout le valeur historique de civilisation. We would never see something that was of value and say, well, you know what, I didn't make it, so I'm not going to respect it. No, because there is no us and them. It's like Sadi's poem at the United Nations, right? He says, if you cannot feel the pain of another human being, you're not worthy of being called human. Well, let me add to that. If you're not willing to acknowledge the contributions of a civilization, and let's just say humankind, then you're not worthy of being called human.
Yeah, I
So
think
why should anybody look at the place that the knowledge comes from and say, oh well, it's less than? You see this in music, that the classical music is touted as a be all end all, that's the greatest in music, and that they, for example, invented harmony. This is not true. Not only did they not invent harmony, I would argue they only invented a certain type of harmony, which then they limited by saying this is what it is. I would argue that polyrhythms are a form of harmony. I would argue that drones, with a melody and a harmony and microtones are a form of harmony. Just because you don't recognize it as such doesn't mean that it's not. I had this discussion with an organist who said, oh, you're playing an organ that's out of tune. I recently did this organ concert. You were there, you attended, and I used microtones extensively. He said, oh, the organ's out of tune. You're playing suffered from playing a bad instrument. I said, do you know what? I tuned the organ to microtones. It was intentional. So then he's like, oh, you must be the first person to do that. Wow, congratulations. I said, no, actually, people have been doing this for a long time. And actually, my musical godfather, Hans Ola Eriksson, who's a famous Swedish organist, has been playing with microtones on organs for almost 50 years. And people at the time would say, oh, well, this is crazy. How dare you, do something this absurd and then call it, classical music. But of course.
So how would you explain what microtones are to people? Because, some people watching this probably know what they are, but don't call them microtones.
Okay, yeah. So I would say that that a tone in the Western system, much like the numerical system of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, is a codified mathematical construct which allows us to essentially create a system of literacy. And so a microtone is the Western way of articulating the notes that are in between quarter tones, which are the smallest formal distinctions of notes in classical music, Western classical music. So a microtone is the notes that lie in between those spaces that have no other codification except that they are microtones. Of course, there are microtones within microtones, and it's like the idea of there are smaller infinities and larger infinities. It's the same concept. Like the space between 1 and 2 has a smaller infinity than the space between 1 and 3. So a microtone is that infinity which cannot be codified within the linguistic boundaries of Western music, and therefore are not acknowledged as part of Western music canon, although of course they are. And you see this in monastic chanting. They have microtones in monastic chanting, even when they're chanting a single line, because each person's shape of the vowel actually imparts different microtones. So when you hear that harmonic whole, that one note, it's actually the result of many partials and many overtones coming together to create that one note that you think you're hearing.
Wow. You just made me think of a project that I'm trying to find a solution for right now.
Mm.
So we're doing an exhibition called Image. And it's about the image in Islam, the importance of imagery, because, there's this myth that, there's no imagery or no representation. And of course,
well, we have different kinds of figurative art.
Well, absolutely. So the abstract geometric language is so sophisticated because when it comes to
but we even have floral motifs, like on the kilat, on the robes of honor, you would have floral motifs depicting paradise. That's figurative. You'd have animals, you'd have butterflies.
Absolutely. I mean, so this exhibition explores all of that. And we wanted to talk about the word. And, so the challenge that we've been posed is how can we create something that allows people to be in an empty space that is about the human voice? It's kind of genderless, maybe two voices, a male and a female, maybe reciting attributes of God from different cultural perspectives, not just, all in English, so that it's accessible to our viewers and our visitors,
Mm.
so that they can experience that idea of their own, imagery,
Mm.
that's being evoked by a word, right? So I don't know. I don't think it's possible, because you're kind of you're asking us to.
I don't think it should simply be in English. I think that's an intellectual fallacy.
Why?
Because first of all, language, especially translated language, loses its original intent. There are words in Gujarati, for example, like banter, knowledge, or to be educated. You know, like even the way you conjugate the verb in Gujarati is so different than the way I would speak about knowledge in English. When you speak about these attributes of God and you put them all in English, you're actually doing it a disservice. I believe you're doing it a disservice to have it in the richness of all languages that are spoken, and then to have a transliterated or translated script that people can read if they so choose. That would honor the original intent while also making it accessible. I wouldn't do it all in English. And it is almost an impossible task, but I think it's possible if you think about it as a kind of, again, it's this idea of harmony. What is harmony? Instead of having maybe two voices, maybe have a computer say it, maybe have a computer say, maybe have AI recite it, for example. Therefore, there's no humanness. It's this thing. It's almost an object. That's what I would do.
I like the AI. Anyway,
because that would be generative, while at the same time honoring that linguistic and cultural richness and milieu that you're trying to evoke. Because of everyone's difference, what you're trying to say is the way we see God or the way we see the divine is different, right? If it was all the same, then yeah, fine, just do it in English. But if it's different, then highlight that difference. It's like saying, I want to take a nude photo of a woman, but I want her to cover herself.
Yeah, I mean, the first place my mind went was music, because for me, music is very abstract.
Yes.
It's
the most closely connected to the ineffable. Yes.
And to language.
Yes. Phonological traditions. All languages, music.
I would agree. I was thinking about, as you were speaking, the music of languages, like the
confluence of cadence.
Exactly. French and English, so, very similar, but very different. And, you said Gujarati, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, Gujarati for me is quite different from Kutchi, which is what I speak. And as a South Asian language, where the one I feel the most comfortable in. Of course, if I have to, I can speak Gujarati. I certainly understand it. And same with Hindi
and Urdu.
And Urdu, absolutely.
Because they all have a common root. You see, they all come from Sanskrit in the same way that all the Latin languages, English, French, Spanish, Italian, they all come from the same root, right? So if you understand the etymology, or frankly, even if you understand the language at a basic level, then it's not very difficult, to understand what a French speaker is saying, even if you don't understand the words in between. Like aéroport, sounds like airport. So
absolutely. I mean, I speak a bit of French, so that means I understand a bit of Spanish and Italian as well, and so we learn. I mean, languages, and you're absolutely right. There are many words in English that don't have an equivalency in
they
other
don't have
languages.
a cognate. They don't have a cognate because they haven't been appellated the same way.
Yeah, and the same, and the reverse is true. There are words that you can't translate from Sanskrit or Hindi or Urdu or Arabic or
like the word in Urdu, insan, human, which in Urdu actually means the one who forgets. I mean, that's beautiful. That's poetic. But when you hear that word, you wouldn't know that, because insan is the literal translation for human, but what it actually means is the one who doesn't remember.
It doesn't remember. No, it's beautiful. And again, that's why it is so important for us to not lose oral traditions as well. And, why the performing arts at the museum, if I can come back to that for a minute, is so important, because it gives us an opportunity to actually deal with many of these music traditions, poetic traditions, performative traditions.
You're the breath. You're the breath in the museum, because without the performing arts, it wouldn't be alive.
Well,
you'd have a body, but it'd be a corpse.
I certainly feel that way, but and I think that many members of the public, I mean, we have, over the years, I've learned to know many of our regular audiences, at least, and enjoy meeting new people who discover the museum all the time. And I think they really appreciate the fact that there are different points of entry into our broader educational mandate and into our collection,
and that you're not trying to limit the way people learn, because you have oral learning, kinesthetic learning, you have you have many different ways of targeting the senses. I remember there was something where the smell was engaged at the museum. I forget what it was about, but there was something to do with perfumes. I think if you engage all the ways that people learn and all the ways that people perceive, then you're actually doing justice to this mandate of education, because to limit the way people learn is actually ridiculous. I mean, we know that the diversity of learning is actually what allows for arts to even be the arts.
Absolutely. And in this new reset world, we have to find, because things change, what's the new purpose and meaning of music and dance? And, in order for it to be meaningful, what does it now have to do? Because it's a condition.
It's a conditional state. That's the thing about all art. It's a conditional state, meaning that it has to adapt. It's like an event horizon. The event horizon only exists for as long as you continue to perceive it the same way. And I wrote a paper about this.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, and it goes back in a more philosophical way to the fact that, hey, you know what? There's no past. There's
no future. It's all here.
There's no future. It's all this moment.
Ask any Sufi. They're all children of the moment, and they're not children of the moment for no reason.
It's a true perception. Absolutely. But I think, again, we have,
because all history is lived. The only thing that separates the past, present, and future is your thinking of where you place yourself within that construct. I mean, time is imaginary. Einstein proved this n times over. Every quantum physicist will tell you that it's just fields. So everything that's in the past it's not in the past. It's literally not in the past. The future is not in the past. It's strange. It's very strange. And anyone that thinks they understand quantum physics, well, a true scientist will say, no, if you think you understand, you've got it wrong. You missed the boat. Because reality is not just strange, it's stranger than we even could think that it possibly is.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the,
and that's where intellectual humility comes in, right? Because again, it's this idea of people that like to think they know what art is. Sometimes I speak to curators and I ask myself, well, yes, you studied art. Yes, you're erudite. Yes, you have studied a tradition, or in some cases, if there are polymath, multiple traditions. But that doesn't mean you know what art is. You know what you think art is, and that's it.
Absolutely. I mean, but that's also why, what's kept me working in the arts for so long is that there's never a dull moment.
It's an eternal fascination. And how could you get bored if you're doing it right?
Yeah, and your definitions are always changing and being altered by the world around you, by what artists are doing, by what artists have done, by what artists are planning to do, and not just artists, but what scientists have done, are doing, and planning to do. What real estate developers have done, are doing, and planning to do. Yeah. Like we're all in this together.
where the smoke decides to go and where the bird decides to fly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's what keeps me there, and the opportunity to always try and imagine, what can be.
And the journey towards death lies in birth.
Absolutely. And vice versa.
Exactly. So for something to be alive, it's like the ephemera is eternal. And that's why I think art matters so much, because the fact that something happens, it'll touch that absolute reality. Even though it's ephemeral, art has to be ephemeral because we're ephemeral. But when you do art, it's absolute. It's connected to that we could call it marifat if we want to be Sufis, but in the scientific sense, the nature of reality. That's what we're doing when we make art.
It's not just our spiritual life. Like, for example, our mental state.
And even physical well-being, cognitive development.
Physical well-being, exactly. That's where I was going with that. I believe that there's a growing body of literature, and there was, when I was actually working more closely in this field, in community cultural development, that, art is not only a positive impact on our health and our mental state, it's actually necessary for a healthy mind and body.
Absolutely. And you know what? The absolute evidence of this has just come from the entire field of early childhood development. I recently gave a lecture for the Institute of Educational Development in Karachi. The Aga Khan University invited me as a guest lecturer. And what I said was that if you really want to see the power of art and the power of music, observe young minds, observe young children, because the way that they learn everything from walking to crawling to speaking to even their eye movements, it's all through art. It's all through sound. It's all through that creative interaction between themselves, the reality, and the people around them. That's how they learn. And if you put a child, let's do a thought experiment. If you put a child in a room and they had nothing and no one to interact with, and you took them out of that room 5 years later, they would still be the same as when they came out of the womb, because they hadn't had a chance to be creative, to interact. So that's how powerful art is. It's not just this luxury. It's neither a luxury nor a commodity. It's an integral aspect of reality, because we are co-creating the reality we exist in. We're constantly making art, whether we're aware of it or not.
And yeah, you're right. I mean, but then again, it becomes and I know that that's what we wanted to talk about. It becomes a very conceptual notion, right? But in terms of a phenomenal,
we are on conceptualism after all.
Yeah. So, but from a phenomenological perspective, we're embodied, we're sensate, and if we can rid ourselves of our preconceptions, our experience of the world, I think would be constantly magical. And in many ways, as an artist, that's what I try and the state of mind I like to be in, or even when I play music, is to be a little bit preconceptual. I mean.
But see, that's the thing. You shouldn't be limited by your senses. You should constantly try to improve the acuity of your senses, because you see, people fall into a priori thinking of what the senses are capable of, where actually I have seen absolute superhuman things being done when people use their senses in ways that were, for the rest of us humans, thought to be impossible. For example, there is a blind man who, using echolocation, can tell you exactly what an object is. He's completely blind. He can tell you exactly what the object is, how far away it is, the dimensions of the object, just by clicking and listening to the way the sound reflects off that object. He's doing what bats do. And it's documented, by the way. It's documented, and he does this. And he's taught other people how to do it. So the acuity of the senses is also a field that is malleable.
No, I think that you're right, and in many ways that is one.
Because how we perceive is how we choose to perceive. That's why I call this thing conceptualism, because I know that the only limit is how you choose to see it.
Yeah, and I believe that whole role of the artist is very much what you've just described in many ways, in maybe a less
abstract way,
grand way, but the idea that you see the world differently. When you experience the world is interpreted through an artist and through other people. I mean, because I think that experience, that ability to sort of go beyond one's
having the courage to ask the question. That's the point. That's what the artist does. That's the difference between the artist and the non-artist, that the artist had the courage to ask that question. And if they're really courageous, to come up with an answer.
Or to, certainly prompt everyone to be able to ask and answer that question for themselves, because it really is about empowering the viewer, in my mind.
Yes.
When a musician shows me something that I never thought was possible, or a combination of notes and rhythm that affects me, my mood and my perception even, or makes me experience an emotion, draws a memory, engages me in that way, it's very much a co-creation, right? With the artist.
Yes.
As well. And again, I think that this I'm trying to get away from language that separates things, that Cartesian desire to categorize everything.
Yes.
Us and them.
Yeah. You and
in
me.
particular, you and me. What else? Sometimes
we and you, for example.
But I think that
or should I say we and no?
I started off my career like curating visual arts and working with contemporary arts, then moving in working with interdisciplinary artists, and then finally musicians, and certainly theater I've been involved with for many years. In fact, right now the museum is doing a play that I think I can use as we wrap this conversation up, in terms of relevance and history. It's by a young, yeah, of course he's young, playwright. It's certainly his debut as a playwright, an actor. His name is Azim Natu. He happens to be a Smiley, but he's a young, contemporary playwright who's written a play set in the historic time of in the year 1184 in Al-Andalus. It's a time when pluralism, ideas,
when the Moors ruled.
Well, when the Moors ruled, but also when the pluralism that they had been practicing, the respect across cultures, all of that was starting to fall apart, and infighting was starting to begin. And it's very relevant to our contemporary times. So even though the play is set in 1184 and is told through the eyes of Ibn Rushd,
Oh, that is cool.
And
that is cool.
Kind of the narrator, it tells this story that's very relevant to us today. It's also a powerful way, storytelling, to be able to raise, and questions for people, and maybe allow viewers to sort of seek their own answers, but certainly learn something about a time in history that we maybe have forgotten or never learned about. To show that this idea of pluralism, this idea of sharing across cultures, is not a brand new idea.
No.
It's something.
It's since time immemorial.
Yeah.
It's even prehistory. It's even before we had written history. We can see it in cave paintings, for example, or in artifacts, like a flute, for example, that has multiple hole configurations, so one for a smaller hand, one for a larger hand.
Yeah, I mean, the more things again also change, they also remain the same, and they repeat. And anyway, I think I always enjoy speaking with you. I probably talked about things that I shouldn't have, but that doesn't matter. I think that as long as we, again, have a sense of safety, that we can be wrong. I'm sure that I've said things that I'll decide I don't believe at a future date. Or
so you're a free thinker. That explains everything. Now I know why we're friends.
Well, I just have to be open to that, right? So and I like to think about these things. I like to talk about these things. I think many people do. And if we can grow that community
and that culture.
And that culture and that conversation.
Cultivate that culture. Plow and till the field. That's what we're doing.
We can't just talk amongst ourselves. We have to talk with everybody.
Yeah.
And everybody who you know, who has that open mind.
Anechoic chambers don't help anyone.
Exactly. So I mean, and hence
that was a joke. That was a joke. I said anechoic, meaning the silent chamber doesn't help anyone.
Well, maybe it does, but yeah, you're right.
Well, certainly John Cage passing out after 20 minutes of listening to his own heartbeat would tell us otherwise. But but seeking the silence within is the goal of any good Sufi. So
well, thanks, Afraz.
It's been a pleasure. Yes, and also I want to end by saying thank you to you for you know, believing in me, for believing in my practice, and for allowing me the space to be who I am.
Well, it's one of the privileges of my work and my position that I get to meet artists from all over the world, and to in those cases where there's a click, get to know them better and to talk about, you know, new work and to understand, you know, the richness, the way that I'm able to sort of have that privilege of learning constantly. It really is a privilege. And, you know, I love that we talked about the multiple ways in which people learn, because that is a very important thing, that learning is not just formal. It's not just
autodidact here.
Yeah. And it shouldn't be didactic. It should also always be in flux.
Exactly. And I like to think of myself in the great tradition of unlettered men like Leonardo da Vinci and Prophet Muhammad.
Wow.
Oh yes. That's the school that I come from, because, you know, there's no wisdom that's contained in a book that can surpass communion with the ineffable, which is actually the invitation that I gave at my concert at the very end of my speech. Let us now commune with the ineffable, because that's where the truth lies.
It's been a pleasure, Afraz. We'll talk to you soon.
Comme d'habitude. Bye.
Okay. Bye.